I have a question for you. Who invented the electric car? Do you know? It wasn't Elon Musk or GM or Toyota or even Nikola Tesla. The golden age of the electric vehicle actually came long before you and I were even born. What we see today is more like a Renaissance period. The real story of the electric car is stranger than you think. The first thing you need to know is that electric vehicles actually predate gasoline-powered combustion engines. That's right, EVs came first, and for a time, the electric car was a preferred method of transportation for everything from ambulances and milk deliveries to the ultra-rich elites. To find the beginning of the story, we need to go all the way back to the early 1800s, when a series of breakthroughs in battery and motor technology enabled the first automotive engineers to develop their own crude prototypes of self-propelled carriages. As for the true inventor of the electric car, that title is largely up for debate, but we do have a list of potential suspects from both the European and American continents. The Scottish inventor Robert Anderson is typically credited with building the first prototype of an electric horse carriage around the year 1832. He invented a single-use battery cell that used crude oil to generate electricity. The prototype would have made for an impressive demonstration at the time, but with a disposable battery and limited range, it was far from a practical transportation option. We can look at another Scottish engineer, Robert Davidson, for the invention of the first electric locomotive in 1837. He developed a prototype machine that could travel 1.5 miles at a speed of 4 miles per hour while pulling 6 tons, at which point the batteries would also need to be replaced. Still not practical, but it scared railway workers bad enough that they burned the prototype to the ground in an act of protest. There's also a blacksmith from Vermont named Thomas Davenport, who was a pioneer of electric motor design, inventing the first commercially successful motor powered by electromagnets. In 1835, he used his motor design to propel a small car around an electric railway track. As groundbreaking as these 1830s designs were, they all suffered from the same fatal flaw. The batteries died quickly, and then they needed to be replaced, meaning that these vehicles could never be practical or economically viable. It would take another 30 years before the French physicist Gaston Plante invented the world's first rechargeable battery. This was using a lead-acid chemistry, basically the same battery that most cars still use to this day. Even with the battery problem solved, though, we wouldn't see the first practical EV until the year 1887. This is William Morrison, a Scottish immigrant and renowned chemist who settled in Des Moines, Iowa, and this was his electric car based on a traditional horse-drawn Surrey carriage that was popular in North America at the time. It was converted to fit 24 of the new rechargeable batteries, a unique design invented by Morrison to be both portable and powerful that would allow the vehicle to carry up to 12 people at a maximum speed of 20 miles per hour and would need recharging once every 50 miles. Morrison's horseless carriage didn't work particularly well. Things like steering and braking hadn't quite been figured out yet, but his demonstration was picked up by the national newswires, and word of the electric car spread to thousands of people across the USA. By 1893, Morrison's self-propelled carriage had become a popular attraction at the Chicago World's Fair. At the turn of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and affluent people around the world were eager to trade in their horse and buggy for brand new motorized vehicles. The emerging automobile market had 3 categories at the time: steam, gasoline, or electric. Steam-powered vehicles had emerged around 1870, and that early advantage was enough to hold 40% of the consumer market by 1900. Trailing closely behind were electric cars at 38%, and internal combustion engines accounted for just 22% of motor vehicles in the USA. Now, at this time, steam power had already begun to fall off, mostly due to the long startup time. It took 45 minutes to get the tanks boiling, and then they constantly needed to be refilled with water, limiting the vehicle's range. Steam would continue on being used for powering factories and locomotives, but more practical solutions would win out for consumer automobiles. Speaking of which, let's talk about the first gasoline-powered cars. We know that Gottlieb Daimler and Carl Benz developed the world's first combustion engine automobiles in Germany in the year 1886, but these early ICE cars were not very well regarded among the bourgeois of the time. Only the elite class could afford the luxury of an automobile, and they weren't interested in hand-cranking a noisy, stinking, smoky gasoline engine that then required them to shift gears as they drove along. By comparison, electric vehicles were elegant and luxurious. They were instantly ready to drive with the flick of a switch. They didn't make a horrible loud puttering noise or emit a cloud of pollution. They didn't even require the driver to change gears. On top of that, electric cars were faster than gasoline power. This motorized carriage, known as the Electrobat, used 2.1 kilowatt electric motors and is remembered for beating internal combustion automobiles in a series of 5-mile sprint races back in 1896. In the spring of 1899, a Belgian inventor named Camille Janazzi, who was building electric cars near Paris at the time, decided to stage a daring high-speed stunt to promote his brand, using a special electric racing car named La Jamais Content, or the Never Satisfied. He became the first person to break the speed barrier of 60 miles per hour, a pair of direct drive 25 kilowatt motors running at 200 volts and drawing 124 amps each, equivalent to about 67 horsepower, propelled the torpedo-shaped machine, which was crafted from a lightweight aluminum alloy called partinium and rode on Michelin rubber tires. The result of all this was that electric cars became quickly popular with the urban city dwellers, people with easy access to electricity. Of course, those living outside of the city at the turn of the century were still without access to the electrical grid, so gasoline managed to take hold in those rural markets. But in the urban environment, the electric vehicle would quickly begin to eclipse the horse-drawn carriage as means for people from all walks of life to get around. The builders of the Electrobat, Pedro Salom and Henry G. Morris, started outfitting their own fleet of electric hansom cabs in New York City. The duo were quickly bought out by Isaac L. Rice, who founded the Electric Vehicle Company. Rice was able to attract funding from big-money investors, and by the early 1900s, the Electric Vehicle Company had over 600 electric taxicabs on the streets of New York, with smaller fleets operating in Boston, Baltimore, and other eastern cities. The long recharging time of these early lead-acid batteries was mitigated with battery swapping stations. The cab would simply pull into a converted ice skating rink, have its dead batteries exchanged for a fresh pack, and get straight back to work. Did you know that the first president of the United States to ride in an electric car was William McKinley? He was shot at the Temple of Music at the Pan American Exhibition in Buffalo, New York on September 6, 1901, and rushed to the hospital in an electric ambulance. He unfortunately did not make it, but his successor, Theodore Roosevelt, did go on to become the first president to intentionally and publicly ride in an electric car. That was a model named by the brand Columbia in 1902. Another famous American to own an electric car was Thomas Edison. Here he is being chauffeured around in his 1902 Studebaker. Edison once teamed up with his old camping buddy Henry Ford to try their hand at making an electric car. They finished at least one prototype before deciding that the gasoline engine had a more promising future, and of course they were right, but Ford had a very uphill battle ahead of him. The first Model T was released in 1908 for a price of just $850, about half the cost of most electrics, but the gasoline engine was still unrefined, loud, and labor-intensive. Even Clara Ford, Henry's own wife, preferred electric cars. She found her husband's product dirty and noisy and was often seen behind the wheel of vehicles from the Detroit Electric Company up until the year 1914. By the mid-1910s, electric cars had received a battery upgrade from Thomas Edison's nickel-iron-based cells, providing even longer range and faster recharging. With electricity becoming even more abundant, trendy department stores in New York City had even begun installing EV charging stations to cater to their wealthy female clientele. But the golden age of the electric car was to be short-lived. Ironically, it would be the electric motor itself that played a key role in killing the electric car. In the year 1912, Cadillac introduced the first gasoline engine with an electric starter. Now, instead of plugging in a crank handle and spin-starting your own engine, drivers would simply turn a key. This, in combination with the widespread adoption of the muffler, would bring a level of refinement to the internal combustion experience that had so far been reserved for electric vehicles. Of course, price was a significant factor as well. By the early 1920s, the price of a Ford Model T had fallen to around $300, while the price of most electric cars had skyrocketed to nearly 10 times that amount. Just the Edison battery upgrade package alone was worth $600. Following World War I and the discovery of oil in Texas, the price of gasoline quickly fell in the United States. This, combined with the speed and efficiency of Henry Ford's moving assembly line, gasoline quickly became the fuel of America, and the Model T was a car for the people, even those who lived beyond the city limits where electricity was still scarce. Now, that's not to say the electric car was completely dead. They still hung on for low-speed, short-range uses in urban centers. The British maintained a fleet of electric milk vans for home delivery that lasted through the 1980s. In the post-World War II Japan, the scarcity of gasoline and oil encouraged the production of electric vehicles through the mid-20th century. From time to time, a major automaker would cobble together a prototype electric car, mostly just to prove a point to environmentalists that it was impossible to make a zero-emissions vehicle that wouldn't cost a fortune. Case in point, the Electrovair. Based on a 1966 Chevrolet Corvair, this used exotic silver zinc batteries providing 532 volts to feed into a 115 horsepower AC induction motor. This setup made as much power as the Chevrolet Flat 6 engine and gave the electrified version similar performance. There were downsides, of course. 800 extra pounds of batteries under the hood had an effect on the car's weight distribution. The top speed was limited to 80 miles an hour, with a range of between 40 and 80 miles, which was made worse by the battery's limit of just 100 charge cycles, not to mention the cost of $160,000 just for the battery pack alone. That's not inflation adjusted either. It was $160,000 in 1966. What's funny here is how much of this history sounds familiar. There are so many of the same narratives still taking place in the modern day. History doesn't always repeat itself, but it very often rhymes. Fortunately, the Renaissance period of the electric car is going much more smoothly. Again, technology has risen to solve the problems that hold back adoption, and eventually, the most convenient, most efficient, and cheapest option will again win out. It might take some time, but this century is when the electric car might finally take over.